This is the Bob Davis Podcast's YouTube channel. So welcome back, everybody. I noticed I'm getting some subscriptions. That's awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And really, the whole idea of the Bob Davis Podcast channel is to drive people to the bobdavispodcast.com when there's a new podcast. I just put up a new podcast called Celebrating 1100 Podcasts, and I'll put the link for that in the description box. So I'm doing the videos to A, add a little content to what I did on an audio podcast, and B, kind of push people to the audio podcast because that is the medium that I'm most familiar with and really still the most interested in. And I don't need to go into a long and involved thing because I already have a couple of times in these videos talking about the difference between video and audio, and certainly from the production realm, for me to do full production television / video, I just don't know if I want to make that investment, so this is what I'm doing. It is pouring down rain out there off and on, and so I am inside Mobile Podcast Command, and I'm doing this video update from inside the ambulance, so we don't have the bucolic landscape to show you, but I'm still down at that campsite by the lake. I've had some great fires, and the other night it was completely still, just absolutely still, and I thought this is a good time to pull out the studio mics, which I keep right over there, and record a sort of commemorative podcast 1100. And I mentioned that, 100 podcasts. So I did a commemorative podcast for 1,000, and I did a commemorative podcast for 500. 100 podcasts, to me, kind of isn't that big of a deal. And it's because I've done so many that I was like, well, but it is actually, it turned out to be really a good subject because the last 100 podcasts really covers in depth a lot of the more focused travel that I have engaged in as a nomad since I started traveling full-time in 2020. People know that I've been going out off and on for 2 or 3 months at a time since 2014 because I found that travel was a really positive source for inspiration for content. And I did that for 6 years in this vehicle. And then in 2020, I started thinking, well, I'm gonna travel, and I'm gonna get myself I'm gonna get a Class A, or I'm gonna get a great RV. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I went in the ambulance because I don't think I would have been as happy, because this thing has turned out to just be a phenomenal vehicle in so many ways. In fact, I do have to show people, the ambulance has not been redone. And so it is basically as it came out of service in 2013, or no, yeah, probably 2012 or 2013, up near Milwaukee, where this ambulance was in service. And right behind me, this piece of paper that's got all the numbers for all the other ambulances in the county and the hospitals and everything else. So I kept that, and I also kept, there's another little container up front with ambulance stuff in it, and I kept that. So I just love that. So this thing has not been redone. It's not going to be redone, and it's a great studio. It just has a great sound to it without really much work, regardless of what kind of mic that you use for audio in this thing. And I don't need to have a big background behind me, and I don't need to show everybody my subway tile walls or anything like that, because it's just still an ambulance. And I love that. And I remember going through all these changes and being very upset because I wanted to get, I had envisioned myself in this beautiful Class A RV, and it just wasn't going to happen because the money wasn't there. I was a struggling podcaster, so I thought, well, okay, I am in fact going to go on the road in this friggin' ambulance, and I'm glad I did, because it's a great platform. It's taken me to places that an RV would not have been able to go. I wouldn't have dared take an RV down to. In fact, here it is. Here's the cup. I would not have dared to take any kind of an RV down the dirt road that you have to take to get to this great campground at Dinosaur National Monument, which is Echo Park. And then I had to go out the back way, which is 40 miles of dirt roads, and they're not real good. And there's a couple of spots. I did a whole podcast about it, and it's kind of funny because I asked somebody, hey, and they had a 4-wheel drive Tundra, and I said, hey, is there a back way? And she goes, oh yeah, it's real easy. You just go out the back way. Well, I came upon a hill where the road literally ended, and I had to walk up about a quarter of a mile to actually figure out that was the road. And this thing did very well. It actually really surprised me. So I could never have done that with an RV, and I get myself into trouble all the time in this thing. Get stuck, flat tires, because I've had to learn. You have to stop and look. So that first year of travel was all before podcast 1000. So then I did podcast 1000, and that was sort of commemorated somewhere in New Mexico. And then the last 100 have really come along during a tumultuous time in our history. First of all, the great unpleasantness of the disease, or whatever you want to call it. Somebody told me on YouTube you have to be careful with using certain terminology, so we'll call it the great unpleasantness for many, many reasons, which really didn't touch me because I was traveling, and because I was traveling in an ambulance, there was really no issues with any of the restrictions that took place. And once you got down to the south, those restrictions were essentially non-existent. So if you traveled through Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, places like that, there was no real restrictions in terms of what you could do. Yeah, I wore a mask when I went into a Walmart if it was required, and it certainly was on Indian reservations because, or I should say Native American reservations, because they had as a group, they had more comorbidities, and so it really cut a swath through the Native American community. Anyway, then the inflation issue started, and that affected the nomad, I think, more than the first unpleasantness. The inflation caused almost all of us to have to just kind of stop. So a lot of the podcasting that I did in the last 100 podcasts were low, as I called it, lower and slower travel. I prefer to travel by doing what I call gallivanting, literally going thousands of miles and then turning around and going 1,000 miles in a different direction, thousands of miles in a different direction, because I was drinking in the whole experience. And I put a lot of miles on this truck, and it still, runs great, and still seems to have been very happy to have the miles put on it during that period of time. And then when the high fuel prices hit, that's when I had to do what I call lower and slower travel, or basically having to sit, because the price of fuel is ridiculous. And I've done more than one podcast about the economy and the economic influences that we're dealing with an ear, in this case an eye, toward nomads and nomad travel and digital nomads as well, who were and are still attempting to stay out of the office and be on the road and still run a business. And the issue is, if you have meetings, if you have to go someplace, if you can spend a lot of money traveling. That is our biggest cost center. So my content changed due to the fact that I was basically stopped down in the desert most of the time. From that, I learned a different way to travel. I learned that it's okay to bivouac. It's okay to stop down and find a place where there's friends and family or friends out in the desert and camp for 6 or 7 months if you have to or if you want to, than to feel that you have to be going back and forth across the country to go see this person and go see that person. I learned, and I think it's evident in that last 100 batch of podcasts, that going to see friends and taking trips, which unfortunately I referred to as wild goose chases in that podcast. It's not that my friends are wild goose chases, or it's not to denigrate friends. It's just that it costs a lot of money to do that, and you get frustrated. And you do see a big part of the country, but I mean, some of the most wonderful things that I've seen is because I decided to go visit friends and take a certain route because I wanted to see or visit with certain friends, and I'm glad I did that. But I've learned, and it's evident in the podcasts, the last 100 podcasts, I learned that isn't always a good idea. Sometimes it's better just to sit and husband your resources, and stand by. So then last summer, I traveled very lightly. I went up into Colorado and Utah, and got to go to some places that I wanted to go to this time, and I was alone almost the whole time of that travel. This year, I came up here. I plan to come up here now. I'm up in Wisconsin. I plan to come to Wisconsin now instead of when I came up here at the end of March and due to family emergencies. So I've been here ever since. And if you've been watching the video channel, then you know that I went from where I appeared in the Peter Santinella videos in the desert to Wisconsin. First I was at the cabin, then I was in the shed, and now I'm down here on the flat where I'm camping, and I feel much better than I did. The other thing I talked about is, I think it's a change in the podcast world. I started podcasting very early. I started in 2009, and you could actually make a living selling your podcast like local radio, which I did. And I have a lot of radio experience, so I know how to sell radio, and I made a living and had 3 or 4 pretty good years as a local podcaster in Minneapolis and St. Paul, kind of just doing the radio show as a podcast. And then I figured out, well, you're stepping on your own content if you put out a podcast every day, first of all. Secondly, since then, one of the things that's happened is podcasting became such a large channel that it really became the new blogging, and now it's almost a social media. So you find yourself having to compete with a million other podcasts. And if you're interested in buying podcasts, by the way that you buy podcasts now is you can self-select 7 or 8 podcasts that you like, and you buy advertising on those 7 and 8 podcasts if it works for your business. Or you just buy all the podcasts. You'd go and you take whatever amount, because they're cheap generally, and you buy 150 or 3,000 or all of them in order to get the word out fast about a particular thing that you're doing. It's the days of buying 60-second spots like you do on the radio in a podcast are kind of over, and I'm not sure that they were ever days, right? But I did do it, and it worked for a while. And then we got into this commoditization, as I call it. In other words, podcast became a commodity that you buy like bushels of corn rather than an individual podcast. Now, YouTube's different because if you have 1 million viewers, it's a different thing. You've got command of a much larger base. I think the opportunities on YouTube are a little bit better. I think with podcasting, you're struggling to dominate a niche, any niche, whatever it is, because everyone's in a niche. Most of the podcasts are, actually, I find most podcasts unlistenable, except mine, which I think everyone does. But most of them are business to business podcasts, or they are friends and family podcasts, or something to that effect. The sort of the top 5 or 6% are actually real content creators trying to do a podcast that has a beginning, a middle, and end, and then deals with different subjects and time to time. There's a lot of interviews. And people ask me, why don't you do interviews? And the answer is, I've found through audio, and through a lot of trial and error, that for the most part, people that you think are interesting, or people that want to be on a podcast, you think they're interesting, but they're kind of not interesting. So what I've taken to doing is sort of synthesizing my experiences through narration in the audio podcast with sound, rather than interviewing just everybody. And what's happened is, because that's really an internal exposition, what has happened is each of these podcasts have really become essays. As a result, I literally have podcasted myself from one place to another. And I talk about in this podcast about the really the personal development tool that podcasting has been for me, which is it has contributed in a big way to changing the way I think in a really positive way. I'm really happy with where I am right now. And I did it all without YouTube. I mean, it was all focused because of the fact that I'm passionate about YouTube. That's the main thing. I mean, no, I can't say that. I don't really want to say that, but I just did. I'm passionate about the podcast business, but I'm most passionate about audio. And that helped me go from one place to another through the effort of podcasting and using sound to tell a story, as well as to tell a story through narrative. I do interview people. I have interviewed people. I like to interview people. But I think I learned through editing that a lot of times it's not what I wanted for a particular podcast. There's only been a couple of times where I've said, boy, that was really great. That was really a great podcast. One of them was this guy, Dave Keel, in Colorado, who is doing the new nomad thing on foot. And he is amazing. I forgot, that's podcast like 978 or something. And I was at Tuttle Creek. No, that's California. I was at Tuttle Creek. He was from Colorado. And he'd been a park ranger and a trail screw and a trail... there are these different jobs with the Park Service regarding trails. One of the first people to finish the big trail up in the Northwest that everyone wants to finish. And he knew how to sling content. He had some really interesting ideas about where the world is headed and why he was doing what he was doing. Literally, the nomad thing on foot. And in many ways presaged or was prescient about some of the things that have happened, whether it's the great unpleasantness, the inflation, the war in Europe, which is what I call it, and other issues that kind of weigh on people these days. So podcasting took me out of a tired rut that I was in for a number of years due to the fact that I was doing talk radio. And once I got out of that rut, I realized there's a whole world of things to talk about and a whole world of things to do, which brings me to the final point, which is that I talked about this interview I saw on YouTube with Dick Cavett and Betty Davis. And she was talking about how in one of the early movies that she made, she was getting paid like $300 a week, which was a lot of money in 1930, right? But still not near the same amount of money that she later made $30,000 a week to make a picture. And Dick Cavett said, boy, that really doesn't sound like a lot of money. And she said, you have to understand that at that time I was choosing parts and choosing directors because I realized that you could not be great unless you were with great people and you were doing the great parts. And so I had a lot of passion for the industry and a lot of passion for acting. I mean, she was a stage actress, and I wanted the good parts. And that's why I did stuff for $300 a week since. And I remembered that I never started out in radio to make a lot of money. That was never my intention. And I think when you start doing your own media, YouTube or audio, as a micro business person, you're hungry. You want to make money, and I think that's a failure, because I never started out in radio to make money, and yet I got to work in New York and Chicago and consult in Los Angeles and program radio station in St. Louis and talk radio very successfully at 2 radio stations, big talk stations, and actually a third for 2 days in Minneapolis. And I got to fill in Seattle and Phoenix and Chicago and other places. So I got to do all the things I wanted to do. Had I been chasing the dollar, I don't think I would have been able to do that stuff, and I wouldn't have learned what I learned. And this is the same thing. We don't know where these things will take us, so we do them because we're passionate about doing them. I'm running an artistic business. That's what I call the BobDavisPodcast.com LLC. It's an artistic business. And as an artistic business, you kind of have to take sort of the idea that small is beautiful and really work on building the content, building the niche, so to speak, building what it is that you want to be all about in the effort, rather than say, well, I'm going to get this many viewers, or I'm going to make this happen or make that happen. Peter Santinello did something to build his channel that he did because he was passionate about it. And he said, I didn't actually start building the channel until I started posting regularly. And he'll tell you the whole story. But again, it has to do with what's inside you and the passion and bringing that out. The exposure of those motivations as an artist, as a human being, will literally take you from one place to another as you go about your process. So that's what podcasting did for me, and that's why I celebrate 1,100 podcasts. It's hard to believe that I've done that many. And I also talked about how when I started, the Genius Bar really wasn't even sure how to get a podcast on the internet, because you had to have a feed somewhere in order to get it on iTunes, just to get it on iTunes. So it had to live on the internet, and they still do. Podcast hosting services allow your podcast to live somewhere on the internet. And the platform where the YouTube stuff exists is the YouTube platform. That's the site that is on the internet, youtube.com, that allows all of us to live and to be rebroadcast and so forth from the internet. Same thing with podcasting. The podcast has to live somewhere. And that's how I got to have my own platform, the BobDavisPodcast.com. So there you go. I also thanked a lot of people donating. I'm getting a lot of donations from people via YouTube that are just coming in. And so I really, really appreciate those things. Again, this is a labor of love. So when someone supports what I do, it makes me feel great. And I really appreciate it. And you can go to the BobDavisPodcast.com, look for the picture of mobile podcast command. If you're on a mobile phone, it's going to be at the bottom. And there's a donate button, and you can give me whatever you want. It's going to go right in the diesel tank. And or you can do a monthly thing. So Brandon Sabata, for example, is doing $5 a month, and other people, sent me very nice notes, and also are doing monthly donation on a monthly schedule for their donations. So I really, really appreciate that. And I should try to keep these short. I don't want to go on and on. So thanks for listening, subscribing. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Follow the links in the description box for the podcast links. And listen to podcast 1100, the Bob Davis Podcast, at the BobDavisPodcast.com. I think it stopped raining, so I can go outside. Bye-bye.